Hey crew, today we're going to be talking about seller's property disclosures. This is your seller sharing information with the buyer or a prospective buyer. So very often you're going to have these forms completed and signed by the seller at the listing appointment or shortly after the listing goes live, because when a buyer submits an offer on the property, they're going to want these disclosures to be part of the contract. So we're going to fill these out ahead of time. And we now have 5 potential disclosures that the sellers are going to complete, because we got a new one this year. And some they will use all the time, some they're going to use part of the time. But we're going to break them down one by one and make sure you understand when to use them and how to complete the forms. And the first one that we're going to take a look at today is the seller's property disclosure statement. Okay, this form has been around for quite a long time. This is the form where the seller is telling the prospective buyer everything that they know about the property. Okay, now they're required by law to share any known latent defects. Okay, they don't have to share everything, but they have to share if they know something is wrong with the property that is not easily recognizable. Latent means hidden. Okay, so there's a leak in the air conditioning coolant system. The water heater doesn't perform correctly. There's a leak in the roof. Those are things that may not be easily seen by somebody making a cursory inspection of the property. Legally, that has to be disclosed, whether they fill out a seller's property disclosure statement or not. The seller's property disclosure statement, though, I encourage you have every one of your sellers fill this form out, where they tell everything that they know. When a seller does not complete a seller's property disclosure, even if they're selling the property as is, okay, if they don't fill the form out, it looks like they're hiding something. Okay, when we talk about as is, you know, we're saying that the seller doesn't plan to make any repairs, not that we don't know anything about the property. And where you'll very often get pushback is investors or heirs of property, somebody that inherited the property. They'll tell you, well, I never lived in the property and I don't know anything about the property. Well, yes, they do know things about the property. They know whether or not, since they became the owner of the property, did they replace the roof? Did they replace the water heater? Did they have any service or work done to the air conditioning unit? So they do know something. There may be lots of things about the property they don't know, and that's okay. We just won't include any information they don't know on the seller's property disclosure. So I hope that makes sense. If you've got questions, give me a call. But I think it's become really obvious as we go through these first 2 forms that they do know information. So the seller's property disclosure statement is an exhibit to the purchase and sale agreement with an offer date of blank for the property known as or located at and the address. Well, when we fill this form out with our seller at the listing agreement, okay, when we're just listing the property, we don't have a contract yet, there's a couple of things we don't know. One is what's our exhibit letter going to be? Where is this getting attached to the contract? Is this going to be exhibit A, B, C? So when we're filling it out with our seller before we have a contract, we leave this blank. We also don't know what the offer date is, so we leave that blank. But when we're making an offer on a property, we're representing the buyer, and we've called the seller and say, can you share with us the seller's property disclosure? And they send it to us. This whole form is going to be filled out except for the exhibit letter and the date. That's all we're going to have to add on the buyer side to the form outside of the signatures. Then as we work our way through the form, it's going to ask the seller specific questions where they're going to share every bit of information they know about the property. When was the property constructed? Is it vacant? Is the property or inner portion leased? Has the property been designated as a historic property? It's going to ask about covenants and restrictions. Is the property subject to CCRs, community covenants and restrictions? Those are the rules that you have to abide by when you live in an HOA community. Is the property part of a condominium community or a community in which there is a community association? Okay. Is there an HOA or is there a condo association? Lead-based paint. Was any part of the dwelling built before 1978, or are any components, fixtures, or materials constructed before 1978? So that's a common misconception that you only use the lead-based paint form when a property was built before 1978. No, it also includes if any of the fixtures were built before 1978. It asks about our structural items. Has there been any settling, movement, cracking, or breaking of the foundation? Are there any structural reinforcements? And those questions go on. Certainly, foundation issues are some of the biggest issues that a property could face. So that's certainly, when you're representing a buyer, something that wants to be an alert. And you'll notice in each of these sections, there's an explanation out here. So if they check yes for anything, you're going to want them to fill this out. Okay. Systems and components. Approximate age of the HVAC system. Has any of it been replaced? When was it last serviced? And so on. We get to sewer, plumbing related items. Okay. The approximate age of the water heater. Where does the water come from? If it's from a well, have there ever been any unsafe tests? What is the sewer system? And these are very important disclosures, because some of the most common lawsuits that take place in real estate are around a property that was marketed as being on sewer, and it turns out it's on septic. And septic has the potential to be a very expensive repair. Other disclosures: roof, gutters, and downspouts. How old is the roof? Has any of it been repaired during the ownership? Are there any current leaks? Is the property ever had any issues with flooding? Okay. Are there any landfills or any settlement taking place anywhere around the property? And the visible soil settlement or movement can be a really common issue for properties that were built back prior to the 70s. Because what builders used to do when they built a house, they built a really big pit. They dug a huge hole, and all the construction debris from the house they dumped in that hole, and then they covered over it. And over time, the wood and the debris that they put into that hole breaks down, and you wind up with settling in that area. So, and property owners will go in and have new dirt brought in and cover it over, but it continues to degrade and will continue to settle. So we want to know, is that potentially going to be an ongoing problem? Have we had any issues with termites, dry rot, pest, or wood destroying organisms? Are there any environmental health or safety concerns? Is there any lawsuits involving the property right now? Or have any been paid? Any pending? Any other hidden defects that have not otherwise been disclosed? Is it zoned agricultural? And then any additional explanation. So if in any of those areas up top we didn't have room to explain our yes and we need more space, this is our space to do that. Okay. Then we're going to get to our fixture checklist. And this is a really important part of this contract. Okay. And this is where your seller is going to mark which appliances are transferring with the property, any home media, any interior fixtures. And you want to go through this list with your seller and make sure that they've checked everything that's pertinent, because there are going to be some things in here that might be a surprise to you, such as, do they plan to take all the light bulbs in the house? Are there any light fixtures they plan to take? Are they taking the mirrors? Those are just a few examples. Okay. The thermostats. It's become very common that people have Nest thermostats, and some people want to take that with them. So you need to tell me, are you planning on leaving the thermostat? The condition of the property when you get to the closing table needs to essentially be the same as it was when the house was bought. So it's not okay for a seller, without disclosing that they're going to do it, to switch out appliances or to switch out thermostats or switch out any other features of the property. Okay, so we want to have really good clarity on what's going to be left behind. Then we get down to clarification regarding multiple items, and they give us a really good example in here. If a seller has 2 different items and they plan on taking 1 or more of them, we need clarity. So if we mark the box up here that the refrigerator is staying, but they have an extra refrigerator in the basement that they plan to take, we need to put in here that they're taking that extra refrigerator with them. Otherwise, it's implied that they are leaving all the refrigerators. And then, is there anything in the house right now that is in current need of repair? Okay. And then we get down to our signature page, and we're going to have our sellers sign this, and you'll see there's no place for you to sign it. Okay. And that's really important. I want you guys to take notice of that. You are not part of this disclosure. You don't know about the property. You're not the one making the disclosure. The seller is making the disclosure. So who fills this form out? The seller does. You don't fill this form out. And I'm going to tell you why. It's to protect you. Okay. We, a few years ago, had an agent in our office that they had their closing. A couple of hours after closing, they got a call from the buyer's agent. And the buyer's agent, hey, the buyers just called me. They got to the house and the refrigerator is gone. And we need the sellers to bring the refrigerator back. And our agent was like, oh my gosh, so sorry about that. Don't know what happened. The movers just probably threw it on the truck, assumed it was going. Let me call the sellers. So they called the seller. And the seller's like, no, we were always planning to take the refrigerator. We weren't going to leave the refrigerator with the house. That wasn't part of the deal. So our agent called the other agent and said, you know, the sellers never intended to leave the refrigerator. They were taking it the whole time. So they won't be bringing the refrigerator back. And the other agent said, but the seller's property disclosure says that the refrigerator is staying. So our contract says that the refrigerator is staying. The seller needs to bring the refrigerator back. So our agent calls the seller and tells the seller that, hey, the seller's property disclosure, where we told them what we were leaving behind, we marked on there that the refrigerator was staying. We've got to bring the refrigerator back. And the seller said, I didn't fill that out. You filled that out. We told you the refrigerator wasn't staying. Guess who bought a new refrigerator that day? The agent. I don't want you guys having to buy anybody's refrigerator. So this form and all of the disclosures, I want you having your clients fill these out. Okay. You can guide them. You can ask questions. You can ask for clarity, but I want them filling it out. And even more than that, we've got the option to send these to our clients for them to fill out digitally. I don't want you to do that. I want you to have them print these out or give them printed copies of these forms and have them put ink to paper. Okay. And the reason that's so important is, one, it's not as easy of a form to fill out digitally. Trying to click all the little boxes and the instructions. Clients typically struggle with making it through this document and make sure they get everything. But everybody knows how to use a pen. So filling it out that way is both easier for them, and two, when it's their handwriting, they filled it out, they marked it. It's really difficult for them to come back later and say that there was an alteration, or that the document was filled out wrong, and certainly they cannot say it was our fault that the document was filled out wrong. So just be really intentional about making sure they are the ones that fill that out. Okay. Now, like I said, you're going to have clients that are going to push back. They don't want to make a disclosure. Okay. They're not going to want to fill this form out. I still encourage you to try and get them to fill this form out. Okay. But this year they have added a new form that is a short form. Okay. That only does two things. And that's going to be our seller's disclosure of latent defects. Okay, so you're going to see this is a very big contrast to the form that we just went through. I like the first form because it makes the owner think about all the different aspects of their property and reminds them that, okay, we need to think about the roof, we need to think about the AC system, we need to think about the plumbing system. Okay, so they're not likely to forget to share something that they know is wrong with the property. But like I said, they are legally required to disclose any latent defects. And on this form right here, you'll see right here, Georgia law requires a seller to disclose latent defects in the seller's property to the buyer of the property of which the seller is aware. Okay, so this form is kind of our fallback. Okay, you don't want to fill out the whole big long seller's property disclosure. We still need to fill out this seller's disclosure of latent defects. And the first portion of this disclosure is going to be just like the other. We're going to leave our exhibit date blank. We're going to leave our offer date blank until we have an offer or a contract for the property known or located at and the address of the property. And then we're going to mark here that there are no known latent defects, or we're going to have our client write in here the things that they do know are wrong with the property. They're going to mark, is the property zoned or adjacent to any agricultural property? And then we get to our fixtures list, the same fixtures list we did before. So even if a seller does not want to disclose all that they know about a property, it's certainly reasonable that they're going to disclose whether or not they intend to take the mailbox or take the swing set with them when they go. So for them to fill this form out, this is a very easy form. Okay, we have the same features down here with our clarification of multiple items, any items needing repair, and then we have our buyer and seller checklist. So pretty easy form there. Hopefully you guys all got that. If you have questions about this, certainly get with me and we'll visit that a little bit more. All right, moving on to our next one. So we've got our seller's property disclosure. We are now talking about our community association disclosure. Does this property belong to an HOA or a condominium association? Okay, because a buyer buying that property needs to know what to expect for what's it going to cost to live in that neighborhood, in that house, in that condo association. What are both my annual fees, and are there any fees to join the association? Okay, those are the two big questions. The tertiary or third question that you're going to need to answer in here is, are there any pending assessments on the property? So those are all things you're going to want to know as a buyer coming in. Or outside of the cost of buying the house, what's it going to cost me to live here? First part of the document follows exactly the same format. So we have our exhibit letter in here. This exhibit's part of an agreement with an offer date of. Again, we're going to leave that blank until we have an offer or a purchase binding contract for the property known as and our address. Then we get into answering questions about the association. Okay, is this a mandatory condominium association, or is it a mandatory homeowners association? Okay, as a reminder, a condo is a type of ownership, not a type of building. Okay, so if the home is owned as a condominium, there is almost certainly going to be a condominium association. Okay, if there is an HOA, the house is not a condo, then it's going to be a mandatory homeowners association. There's some neighborhoods out there that have a volunteer homeowners association, but you don't have to join the HOA, but you don't have access to some of the resources. You don't get to use the pool, you don't get to use the tennis courts unless you choose to be part of the homeowners association. And then we have the option of, is there a master membership and a master association? For some neighborhoods, there is a collection of many neighborhoods, okay, that are all part of one big neighborhood. I hate using that word again. So you very often will have a main road that comes through, and then you'll have a 55 and up community, and you'll have a $200,000 properties, and then you'll have a $250,000 properties, and you'll have $300,000 properties, and then you have some custom homes at the back. And all of those neighborhoods share one big resort style pool, big pavilion, they've got the lake, okay? Well, you're gonna have both your HOA for your little section, that in that 55 and up community, you probably have to take care of the signage up at the front, and all of the houses may include, as part of their HOA, yard maintenance. Okay, so you're going to pay your HOA fees for your little neighborhood, but then you also have your master association where you're paying for access to the big pool and the gazebo and the tennis courts and such. Okay, and it's two different entities. Everybody in all those neighborhoods belongs to the master association, and they belong to the HOA for their little section, the custom home section, the $300,000 home section. Each of them is going to have their own signage, may or may not be gated, may or may not have different features. So most HOAs are just going to be the mandatory homeowners association. It's just in those big communities that you're going to have that master association. And then, do we have any age restrictions? Is this a 55 and up community or a 62 and up community? So we're going to mark those. Are there any other mandatory association fees outside of the annual fees? Okay, and in each one of these sections, you'll see it's $600 per year and is paid in one installment. It's $2,400 a year and is paid in 12 installments of $200 a piece. Okay, so we're going to fill those in. Any other association fees? Is there a one-time fee per year? Are utilities billed separately by the association? There are some HOA associations that part of belonging to the association is you are your water is provided to you, but you are billed for that. How do we get hold of the HOA? Okay, what's our contact information? Is it self-managed, or is a property management company that manages that HOA? Then we get to, are there any charges for using any of the utilities, or do you contract for those utilities on your own? If these are part of the association, we're going to mark them. And then, are there any common elements? What do we get for belonging to the HOA? Do we get these things? Do we get the pool? Do we get the tennis courts? Special assessments. Now, what a special assessment is if the HOA does not have enough money to do some major repair or installation. So in your neighborhood, the pool has gotten cracked and you're going to have to completely redo the pool. Okay, and it's going to cost $40,000 to redo the pool, and there's not enough funds in the HOA. Well, they will do a special assessment. Okay, and they will break that cost up among all the members of the HOA and say, we're redoing the pool, you owe us this much extra money. So this section right here asks, is there a special assessment that is owing, has been approved, or is under consideration? Has it already passed and your portion is going to be this, or is it under consideration and it's this, and or it's already passed by the master association, if there's a master association that's doing an assessment. So is it the HOA or the master association? Then we've got a little clause in here that says if something new comes up after going under contract, where something is considered or approved as a special assessment, if it's more than this amount, the buyer will have the right to terminate the contract. So we go under contract, the seller gets a notice that every homeowner is going to be charged $2,000 to renovate the clubhouse. Okay, well, if this were $500 or more, the buyer can now choose to still buy the house because they're going to have to pay that $2,000 when the work is ready to be done, or they can terminate the contract without penalty within 5 days of notification. Okay. Are there any lawsuits involving the HOA right now? Has the seller received any notice that they're in violations of anything? Is the house painted the wrong color? Did they erroneously paint or install a fence in the backyard? Do they not have enough mulch in their flower beds? All of those could potentially be a violation with the HOA, and they could have things that have to be corrected the day that they move in, or they're going to start accumulating some charges. Then we have fees paid at or prior to closing. Okay, and this is a really important section. It's going to set us up for the same conversation that we just had about the seller's property disclosure. The key place in here is seller warrants at closing that buyer shall be required to pay no more than X number of dollars for all transfer, initiation, and administrative fees. Seller shall pay any amount in excess of this sum. Okay. We want the seller filling this form out, just like with the other one. Okay. They may tell you, here's who the HOA is, that you've got the phone number, you got their email. You could go get that information for them and be a service to your client. And that's what we're tempted to do, is we really want to service our client well. We want to go get this information. We want to fill this out and make it as easy for them as possible. But let's say that we call the HOA, and the HOA says, yeah, we've got an initiation fee, it's $500. Okay, and we come in here and we put in here that the seller that warrants a closing buyer shall be required to pay no more than $500 for all transfer, initiation, and administrative fees. Well, we misheard them, and they actually said it was $1,500. Okay, or the person that answered the phone was new, and they just thought it was $500. But in actuality, it was $1,500. That means our seller is going to have to pay $1,000 that should have been paid by the buyer. Okay, who's the seller going to be upset with? Who's the seller going to expect to pay that sum? It's you. And I don't want you paying anything. I want you to be getting paid. So you don't fill this form out. You provide it to your client for them to fill out. You review it, make sure they filled it out correctly, answer any questions that they have about the form, ask questions when they didn't fill something out right, or if something doesn't look right. And certainly I'm glad to look at these with you and help you guys with it. but because of this right here that sets a limit on what the buyer says, and back at the beginning what the annual fees are, those numbers need to be right. Okay, so we want to have our client do it. And again, buyer's initials, seller's initials. You are not part of this at all. Okay. Our next one, I'm going to go ahead and jump over to the DeKalb County plumbing disclosure. Okay. Now, this is a disclosure that is only necessary if the property is in unincorporated DeKalb County and it was built before 1973. Okay. So that's your condition. And there's really nothing to fill out on this form. So this is going to be a super easy form. We just have to have it when a property meets that specific criteria. We're going to leave the exhibit letter blank as before, leave the offer date blank. We're going to fill in our property information. But if we're making an offer on a property, we're going to have asked for this from the seller. They will have already signed it. And we'll put in the exhibit letter and the offer date then. Everything else is complete. Okay. And to sum up what this form says in a nutshell, it's just a one-page form here. What it says in a nutshell is that when you go to apply for water service as a buyer, that DeKalb County is going to require you to have a certificate that says your property is low flow. Okay, that all the fixtures and everything in the property are low flow fixtures. And if you don't have that certificate, we're not going to turn your water on. Okay, do you think as a buyer you want to know that going in? Yeah, you do. And so that's the reason we're disclosing. We want to make sure, because that's not a condition everywhere and only a condition in DeKalb County. We want to make sure that they know they're stepping into that as a potential problem. Okay, and just to read it really quick, seller hereby discloses the property that the property is located in unincorporated DeKalb County and contains a residence or other structure constructed prior to 1993, and the buyer shall be obligated as a condition of applying for water service from DeKalb County to attach the application a certificate of compliance signed by a home inspector. Okay, so that certificate that you're going to have when you're representing a buyer that just bought a home, that the certificate they're going to need to get their water turned on comes from who? Comes from the home inspector. So they're going to want to have their home inspection done. And all home inspectors know, all the professional ones, that they're going to need to generate that home inspection, the certificate that says everything's low flow. And what that certificate says is that a water consuming plumbing fixture are throughout the property. And what they mean by that, all the toilets use a maximum of 1.6 gallons per flush, urinals a maximum of 1 gallon, shower heads 2.5 gallons a minute, and all fixtures are now marked that they are low flow. So that home inspector is just double checking that everything's good, and they're signing a page for the buyer that says, yes, everything's good. Take this to when you get your water and you'll be just fine. Okay. Now, there are some exemptions. So if the property is currently in foreclosure status, don't have to have the certificate. Okay. If the buyer is demolishing the residence, you don't have to have it. If the buyer is a spouse, child, or parent of the seller, okay, so a property is transferring as part of an estate, or even before someone has passed, then it doesn't have to. The cost to install the water conserving fixtures exceeds $1,000 per toilet, and I don't know why that would ever be the case. And the cost to install water conserving fixtures exceeds $2,000 per toilet in a commercial property, and I don't know why that would be the case. Okay, so that makes this one a pretty easy form to fill out. Okay, and if you've got any questions about it and whether or not it's necessary, certainly get with me. Now I want to get to what is one of the single most important forms that we have in real estate, and this has been reformatted this year for 2021. It's a little bit easier to read now. Everything's been spread out and spaced. But the thing I want you to know about this, at least in the old structure, there were 15 different places that you could make a mistake on this form. Okay, and why that's important is this is not just a Georgia Association of Realtors requirement, not a GREC requirement. This is a federal law requirement that any property built before 1978 or has fixtures built before 1978 has to have this form. And if you do not have this form, or if you have filled this form out correctly, the fines and the penalties are punitive. They are just massive. For every mistake you make on this form, you stand to be fined $15,000 for every mistake. So if we made 12 mistakes on the form, which is how many places we could screw this up, what's that fine come to? $180,000. And that's a fine to the agent, not to the broker, and it's not covered by errors and omissions insurance. So do I have everybody's attention now? Okay. Don't want you scared about this. It's actually an easy form. Okay. But there's definitely things that have to be done and have to be done right. Okay. So I want to make sure you guys have really good clarity around this form. So we're going to leave the exhibit letter blank. When the seller's filling this out, we'll fill this in when we're making our offer. This exhibit pertains to a certain property known as, and the address of our property. Okay. Then everything that they've given us in here is just initials and signatures, but they're all super important. And one thing that's really important about this is the who signs it first. Okay. And this is a lot of other agents at other brokerages don't understand this, don't understand how important it is. So I really want to create some clarity around this. Number one, federal law says you cannot have a binding contract without this form. Okay, you have to have a lead-based contract if the property was built before 1978 or has fixtures that were built before 1978. You can't have a binding contract without this. And what you will see some other agents do is they will send you an offer, and in the special stipulations, it will say that seller to provide lead-based paint disclosure within 3 days of binding agreement. Well, guess what? You can't have a binding agreement without it. Okay? And it tells you right here, under federal law, this exhibit must be signed by the seller and buyer, and the buyer provided with a copy of the lead-based paint brochure prior to the buyer and seller entering into a binding agreement. Okay? So this can't come later. Okay? We can't both sign the agreement and have a contract without this form if that house was built before 1978. And so if you get any pushback, if you get any questions, make sure you bring them right to this form and point out to them the first 2 lines of this so they understand we have to have this before we can go binding, but before we can have a contract. The second thing that other agents will do will be like, well, have your buyer fill it out and send it to me, and we'll have the seller sign it. It doesn't work that way. This is a disclosure, okay? And so I, as a buyer, cannot hear what you're saying before you say it. You're disclosing something to me. You're telling me something. I can't sign that I heard what you're saying before you've told me, okay? So who has to sign this form first? The seller. Okay, seller has to sign this form before the buyer. And in today's world, that becomes really obvious because with digital signatures, everything's timestamped. Okay, so we know who signed it first, the buyer or the seller. Okay, and I don't want to put my clients in a situation, I don't want to put me in a situation where anybody could ever go into a court and testify that the buyer signed it first. Okay, this is probably never going to be an issue for you, so I don't want you guys scared of it. I just want you to know the right way to do it so that you can do it the right way every time. So here's how we fill the form out. So the first thing we have is the seller's disclosure. Okay, so presence of lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazard. The section not initialed below shall not be part of this exhibit. So we're going to initial right here that there is known lead-based paint, okay, with an explanation of why we know or where we know, how we found out there's lead-based paint. Or we're going to initial on number 2. Seller has no knowledge of lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazards in the house. Okay, and it tells us right here, initial 1 or 2 below. So one of these 2 has to have initials on it. Okay, we're still under the seller's disclosure. Right here, records and reports available to the seller. Number 1, seller has provided the buyer with all available records and reports pertaining to lead-based paint. Or number 2, seller has no reports or records pertaining to lead-based paint. Seller has to sign one of those 2 places. Okay, so the seller has signed initial twice here, once up here, once down here, and then the seller is going to come down here and they're going to print their name and sign. Okay, that's the seller's obligation. It's just that. Okay, I know there's lead-based paint or I don't know there's lead-based paint. I've got reports on lead-based paint or I don't have any reports on lead-based paint. That's all they have to disclose. Okay. Then the selling agent, the seller's agent, the listing agent, okay, has informed the seller of the seller's obligation and is aware of her responsibility to ensure in compliance. So if you are the listing agent, you're going to initial right here, and you're going to initial down here. Not initial, sign down here. So listing agent is going to initial once and sign at the bottom. Okay. We now have a disclosure that we can share with a buyer. Okay. At that point. Okay. Or that's what needs to be on the lead-based paint if we're representing the buyer when the seller signs it, sends it to us. So make sure they have filled that form out correctly. Hopefully this is really simple so far for you. All right. Then we have our buyer. Okay. So the buyer needs to initial all applicable sections below. And there's 3 places that the buyer needs to initial. 1, the buyer has received copies of all the information, if any, listed above. So they didn't have any reports. Yep, we got no reports. They did have reports. Yes, we got the reports. We're initialing line C. Okay. Number 2, buyer has received the pamphlet, Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home. Who do they get that pamphlet from? They get it from you. Okay. So you need to share that. And it says up here that they can't have a binding contract until they've received it. Under federal law, this exhibit must be signed by the seller and buyer, and the buyer provided with a copy of the lead-based paint brochure prior to the buyer and seller entering into a binding agreement. So if that house was built before 1978 or has fixtures before 1978, you as the buyer's agent have to share with them the Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home. Okay, so they're going to initial the first box, the second box, and the buyer has initialed either 1 or 2. We are asking for and getting a 10-day opportunity to inspect for lead-based paint. Okay, this is a different inspection than our home inspection. Okay, we're specifically asking for an inspection to look for lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazards, or we're waiving the right to do an inspection. And I can tell you, in all of the transactions I've ever done, I've never had a buyer do a lead-based paint inspection. Okay, so that may be the case for you, but it's their prerogative. They're the ones that get to make that decision. So we're either going to do C, D, or we're definitely going to do C, definitely going to do D, and we're going to do one of the two options on here. Then our buyer's going to sign down here, and we are signing right here as the buyer's agent. Okay. And guys, that's it. Those are the 5 disclosures that we're going to use in our transactions. If you guys have any questions about any of these, certainly call me, text me, email me. I'm here to help you. Have a great day.